All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the official book launch for Objects USA 2020, published by Art& Company and Monacelli Press. So while we're waiting for everyone to join, I'll just go ahead and share that Monacelli created a special discount code for 20% off book purchases, which we're going to share in the link chat just in a minute. And if you don't have the book, I highly recommend you get it. And after what you're going to see and hear over the next hour, I have no doubt you're going to win a copy. So I think we should be just about ready to start. So I'll pass the torch to Glenn Adamson, who was the main author of the book and the main curator of the exhibition that led to this book, and that is going to open at Art& Company in February of next year. And he will take us on a journey through all things Objects USA with the authors, curators, artists, and other people involved in this project. So off to you, Glenn.
Thank you so much, Mina, and it's a great pleasure to be with all of you today, virtually, of course. Thanks very much for tuning in. We are going to have an hour-long conversation, absolutely stuffed with amazing objects and amazing people to talk about them, and all circulating around the anniversary of Objects USA, the great exhibition and book that happened towards the end of the, classic period of the studio craft movement. So the exhibition itself happened in 1969. The book was published in 1970, so that's the 50th anniversary that we're marking. Of course, our exhibition is going to be opening at Art& Company early in 2021, so slightly missed that anniversary, but hey, this is 2020, and that's how we roll. So we're not going to get hung up on that and instead talk about this amazing milestone and what we've done to celebrate it. So first, I'm going to bring onto the stage my friend and colleague and collaborator, James Zemaitis. Hi, James.
Hi, Glenn.
Great to see you. So let's talk about the original exhibition. What was it? Who made it happen? And what was the effect of it? Do you want to kick off?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, in a nutshell, the original exhibition organized by the New York dealer Lee Nordness and the curator Paul Smith of the Museum of Contemporary Craft, now MAD, and in conjunction with the Johnson Wax family, who underwrote everything. And in the catalog that we're discussing, the Objects USA 2020 catalog, my essay in there is highly indebted to the writings of Gloria Kenyon, who will be on this show in just a few minutes, and her 2011 thesis on the original exhibition. And because we were producing this catalog, riffing off of the original catalog, which was published 1 year later, my essay really was sort of unpacking the catalog itself and not the original exhibition. I summarized the exhibition, highly indebted to Gloria. But really what I wanted to look at, and we're looking at the first slide right here, Glenn, is I wanted to sort of see in my essay how we landed at Objects USA, the show and catalog in the late 60s. And sort of the thesis that I had is that there was this 1966 article in Life magazine, July 1966, entitled "The Old Crafts Find New Hands," with these incredible photographs by Nina Lean. And what we're looking at right here on the screen is Bill Sachs, who was part of the utilitarian wing of ceramicists and makers in the original show, and his wife at the time, Dorian Zakai, the weaver, who was also in the show. And when you look at this photo, you see this highly romantic, view of the American maker, outside, Sachs is in this incredible pose, super handsome, rolling out his dough while his wife's, weavings flutter above. Let's go to the next slide too, please. And other photos in this original 1966 Life magazine article show the artists who would be in Objects USA in these heroic poses, which is very much sort of goes with what would become the prevailing sentiment of the original show and catalog, that all of these makers are artists and not, whittlers and quilters and backwoods crafties, as the Life magazine article talked about, that they were not. And instead, they were more part of the abstract expressionist tradition in art at the time. And so, you have Harvey Littleton, blowing a fanfare here in terms of his glass. You have Lenore Tawney, weaving, and these incredible kind of heroic gestures are really at the core of what the curators were trying to achieve in the catalog, Glenn.
Yeah, I love these pictures. So you have Littleton as the angelic trumpeter and Tawny as the ethereal, about to undergo some kind of apotheosis to heaven with her cat Pansy looking up at her reverentially, just to complete the picture of the saint at work. Yeah, so this is what I meant when I said this is the kind of crest of the wave of the craft movement in the 1960s. Because we have these heroic figures, notably, by the way, not all men, because as we're seeing already, there's a pretty good gender balance in the original exhibition, which is a topic we might get back to. But that's a distinctive feature of the post-war craft movement, that it presented an idea of avant-garde activity and practice that was actually pretty much gender equal. A lot of, and egalitarianism was a big part of the message of the original project. Maybe we should go on to the next image.
Yes, and here, Glenn, it's really to go back to what you were just saying there. It's really quite amazing how diverse the original show was. There were 308 artists in the original show, and in creating both the exhibition catalog that we have now in 2020 and our upcoming show, you and I selected 50 of those 308 artists, and we really wanted to sort of continue that diversity that was in the original show. And there were artists of every color. There were so many immigrants who had fled Nazi Europe. There were those who had been held in Japanese American concentration camps here in the States. And there really was this kind of representative sampling that I think they achieved. It's not perfect. There's still a significant group of famous old white guys in both the original show and our show. But it's sort of like Biden's cabinet choices, right? Like it was definitely a pretty good sampling back then, and it's what we try to do again today. And in looking at this slide here, I just wanted to give a quick idea, just via woodworking, of what we are trying to achieve in the new catalog and new show, in that you have somebody like George Nakashima, who was already an icon in 1969, who was already one of the most famous, craftspeople in America, and who continues to be that today. And so we had to obviously select artists like Nakashima, who are, continue to be so important. But at the same time, we also wanted to highlight some of the artists who were completely overlooked in the years since 1969, 1970. And that would be someone like Lee Rohde here, who, son of Gilbert Rohde, who was an avocational craftsman at the time, who really, participated in shows organized by Paul Smith, but didn't really follow a career. And yet he's alive and well today, has a fascinating story to tell, and we wanted to capture people like him in the show as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the fact that Nakashima was, of course, interned in one of the World War II era Japanese relocation camps, and actually learned a lot about his woodworking skills from another Japanese American craftsperson, Kenneth Hikagawa. So that there's a lot of amazing stories that capture the history of America in the war period and post-war period that run through Objects USA. We tried to pick as many of those out as we could. Let's go on to the next slide.
And this is my final slide. And again, in my essay, what I really tried to do in the catalog was unpack chapter by chapter. And since the chapters in the original catalog were divided up by mediums, so you have the metals chapter, the woodworking chapter, the silver chapter, the weaving chapter, what I really was sort of like breaking down both statistically as well as looking at the stories behind as many of the artists as I possibly could cram into my word count in the catalog. And obviously there were many that we couldn't include in the current catalog and show, but we'd like to touch on because there's, the diversity was quite startling. And so here on the left, we're looking at one of the two absolutely spectacular mixed media textiles by Alma Lesch that was in the original show that are now in the Museum of Art and Design in New York. And someone who, as Gloria probably attests to, was immensely popular at the time in terms of the reception given to her work in the show, but might be completely forgotten by the vast majority of us collectors, curators, dealers, what have you today. And then on the right side, again, the diversity was so complex in the original show. There was even a handful of artists who were in monastic orders, religious communities at the time. And here's one of my favorites, Sister Mary Remy Rever. And again, we would have loved to have her in the show, but trying to even find one of her works is near impossible. And the work that was in the original show is in the Carnegie Museum today and hasn't been seen in 50 years. So these are some of the stories we tried to touch on in the catalog.
Great, thanks, James. It might be worth saying that, of course, the original object checklist for the exhibition was absorbed into museum collections, including MADS, of course, which where
Yes.
the majority of them reside. So what we did was to conduct research to find works by artists from the same period that were somewhat comparable. So it's a kind of para exhibition that runs alongside the original Objects USA and, of course, the contemporary artists that we'll be getting to in a minute. Okay, James, that was great. Thank you. And let's now talk to Gloria Kenyon. And so, Gloria, hello.
Hi, Glenn.
Hey, how you doing? We're going to be talking about Paul Smith. We have a great feature in the book that really replicates an interview that you conducted with Paul at the Renwick before his untimely passing earlier this year. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about your relationship to the subject and also your relationship with Paul specifically.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to James for the kind words. As he mentioned, I wrote my 2011 master's thesis for my degree in History of Decorative Arts on Objects USA. And I was really fortunate to have interviewed Paul back in 2010, 2011 for that thesis. He was such a wonderful human being and so willing to share his knowledge. And I'm so grateful for the time that he gave me for my thesis. And then in my current role as the senior programs coordinator for the Smithsonian American Art Museum and Renwick Gallery, we hosted a 50th anniversary program about Objects USA, where I interviewed Paul and just talked with him a lot about his vast knowledge about the craft world at the time, working with Lee. In this picture, you see Paul, Lee, and Johnson, forget which Johnson. I want to think. So who they sponsored the exhibition, and this is at the opening, which is in the building that now houses the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So I feel like I knew. So this is an installation shot of the exhibition. It was huge, as James mentioned, and as it moved around, it always got kind of reconfigured into different things. And because it had so many different artists and different mediums, it didn't fit one mold. The book is arranged by medium, but I love the way it was installed with all of the different pieces next to one another.
Yeah. And it is worth emphasizing the scale of this tour. It went to 20 museums in America and 10 in Europe, if everyone can believe that. And some of the objects, apparently, when they returned, were pretty beaten up, as you can imagine, a 30-venue tour. So it actually went on for years. I think it went till 75, 76, something like that.
Yes. So it toured in the US for 3 years, and then two for in Europe. So yes, and they were in the Lee Nordness's archives at the Archives of American Art, and there's all these letters, both of museums clamoring to have this exhibition, and because it was so big, a lot of places couldn't take it. So it was kind of we'd like to have this exhibition, and Lee would write back and say, well, how much square footage do you have? So people really wanted this exhibition in their spaces. And then, yes, there are also letters of works that got broken during the exhibition or damaged, because it's hard on a huge exhibition to travel that much. It definitely took a toll.
Yeah, there you see the actual itinerary, if you can see it on your Zoom screen there. So it was
Yes.
mega, as you can see. And maybe the other thing to say is that it was, as you already alluded to, wildly popular. I believe it actually broke attendance records in its inaugural venue in Washington, D.C., and that may well have been the case at other venues as well. So this wasn't like a kind of sleepy, friendly craft thing happening off on the side. This was one of the great cultural events of the era. And it was also picked up on television, for example, which is an important point to stress perhaps. Gloria, can you tell us about that?
Yes, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And then Michele, who we'll hear from later, she traveled to see this exhibition, talking about breaking the records. Folks, and I talked briefly about this in my thesis, but just how popular this was. And that was helped by television. So there were features on the Today Show, which feels so phenomenal that they would come and talk about it. My favorite anecdote that Paul shared was that in an interview with Barbara Walters, she decided she wanted one of the pieces. And so she purchased something from the show. So yeah, then there was also a special, I think I wrote it down, but I don't remember, that aired on ABC in prime time, talking about the crafts people featured in the exhibition and the exhibition itself. So with these hands, thank you. Much appreciation. So yeah, it was in addition. So, and then James spoke about the Life magazine article, and they had a great press reception. So it had television helped. It was written in all sorts of magazines and newspapers. One of my favorite articles was called "The Dropout Generation Takes on Craft," and how folks were rejecting technology of the 60s to start making things with their hands, which I think resonates today, and how as we all talk to one another via our Zoom screens, what does craft mean for us in that realm?
Well, that's a perfect segue, because we're now going to turn to the contemporary part of the show with Evan and Abby. I did want to just mention briefly that we had another great collaboration for the project with the Racine Art Museum, and they actually had With These Hands playing in the gallery when they did their own Objects USA Redux show that also traveled down to Houston to the Museum of Contemporary Crafts there. And Lena Vigna from RAM also contributed a really fascinating piece for the book that's about the selling program that Lee Nordness in particular was keen to promote around the exhibition's tour. So that's another great thing people will find in the book. So let's talk about Objects USA ? Evan, Abby, great to have you with us. Evan obviously is one of the founding partners of our company, and Abby is the inspiring impresario behind the entity that is Object and Thing, which just recently concluded an incredible presentation, collaborative presentation at Noise House, that is also very well known for the fairs that you've been holding in New York City. So Abby, welcome. Evan, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Good to see you guys. So Evan, maybe you could start by explaining a little bit about how we went about choosing the 50 artists to represent the contemporary half of the show.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, I guess this whole exhibition is been such a big project, and knowing so much about the original exhibition again is something that I have been thinking about and talking about, inside the gallery for many years, and the moment of wanting to bring something like this back to the audience today was so important, and the timing of it also felt really more relevant than maybe even 5 years ago. But Zesty and I at R&Company, we've spent the better part of 20 years representing contemporary artists who are makers, who are in the fields of ceramics or glass, or working in these mediums, but not necessarily looking at themselves as such, as artists tied to a particular medium. So when we started, you mentioned about the idea of the show, we didn't want it to be categorized by medium. So it was important to have the show not follow those same scripts, but at the same time, we did use that beautiful book from 1970 as a reference point, and then the contemporary book you'll see is really inspired graphically using the same graphics as the original book. And it's such a strong graphic. We wanted to honor that. And obviously this is, this show has, so many artists. When I think about that original show with the 300 plus artists, and we're taking on 100, it's such a massive undertaking. But so I guess to your question, what we wanted to do with the contemporary aspect of the show was really represent what's happening today. So again, very similar to what I think Lee and Paul were trying to capture was a moment in time that represented what was happening in the field of art and the relationships between these artists and maybe tying together the worlds of contemporary art and design and craft. That's kind of our goal here. And I think those worlds were very much tied together when the original show was organized. And then over the course of the last 40 years have sort of drifted apart. And now our goal, and I think this show represents how those worlds are now coming back together. This is very important about, really this moment. And that's what I think we wanted to capture with this show. And at the same time, making sure, as you mentioned, Glenn, the idea of the diversity of the original show, so key to this show. That was maybe the first thing I think we talked about when we all met about who the contemporaries might be, was that we needed to represent all aspects of the design world, of the craft world, the art world, by age, gender, race, as best we could. So I think this was very important, and I think we're really just starting. I think we have this could grow much further, and hopefully this show, not only represents the artists who we know, who are famous in the contemporary sphere, but those who we don't know, who have never really been talked about or seen before on a broader stage. So that, I think, is another goal of this, is to kind of equal the playing field. There's no hierarchy here between who's known or not known. Everyone gets a fair share and a fair representation in the show and in the exhibition installation itself when we get to that.
Yeah, and Evan will be designing that installation for the gallery, so please come back early in the part of 2021 to see that in New York. Just to say one last thing about the sense of being spoiled for choice. We were only able to include 50 people for the contemporary, but we could easily have chosen 308. Probably
it's true.
108 without any difficulty. So it was really tough to choose, but we were trying to capture a certain kind of diversity, not just demographic, but also in terms of materials, in terms of aesthetics, in terms of working methods, and so on. So I guess people will make their own judgments about the choices that we made, but certainly we had a huge and enjoyable time doing it. I will say we didn't get quite as much diversity as in the original, only in the sense that there are no members of the clergy that I'm aware of. So no nuns, no priests. Sorry,
we'll have to ordain someone.
Yeah. So let's bring Abby onto the stage, and we can go to the next image as well, maybe. Great, Abby, how are you doing?
Hi, thank you for having me and inviting me to this project. It's objects and thinking about where objects intersect between art and design is my passion. So this has been a real privilege.
I was going to actually ask you about that word object. So we stole the title for this of my essay for this segment, which is Objects ? USA ? The USA part is maybe easy to understand because, of course, America, the United States of America, is not a bounded entity. Obviously, it is geographically, but it isn't culturally. And like the original show, we were thinking a lot about immigrants and passages in and out of the United States when thinking about our participants. And of course, also insofar as we were doing this in what has proven to be the end of the Trump era, we were also thinking a lot about the policing of borders. Tanya Aguiniga, who was one of the artists in the last slide, was very interesting to speak to about that at the symposium that Gloria hosted down there at the Smithsonian. But here we're looking at the work of Woody Diathello just as an example, one of our great contemporary makers. And I was wondering, Abby, if you could talk a little bit about objecthood and objects as a kind of interest of yours, and how you see this exhibition as developing perhaps a new or interesting narrative around that concept.
Sure. So I think, and your essay really exquisitely gets into this in the book, but the original exhibition and ours, we use that term makers when we're referring to those that are creating these objects. And I think that's where my entry point to objects is too, is that both artists and designers, it's really makers, are dealing with objects and creating objects. It's a more kind of neutral ground than, let's say, a painting or a ceramic functional bowl. And so you can look at them from that very just kind of even plane, and not have that hierarchy that so often exists. So, and Woody, to bring that up right here, is a perfect example. So he mostly operates in the art world and went to art school in the Bay Area, and he's making sculpture that is often from a ceramic material, but not always. And there isn't a function to it other than it being a sculpture. And so I think for me, that is the interest of objects. It's something that everyone kind of has access and ownership of.
Yeah, another reason to highlight Woody here is that we were looking in the choices for our contemporary 50 artists we were looking to emphasize connections to the past. And as you said, Woody, although he's from Texas originally, I believe, was trained in the Bay Area, and he's sort of thinking about the legacy of various Bay Area movements, among them the funk ceramics movement that was so well represented in the original show.
For sure. And that was a really fun and interesting part of our process, I think, was thinking about these artists that are sort of direct inheritors from the original exhibition. And I think we saw that in many people with Vulcus, especially coming through with quite a few of those that were working with ceramics. And, you know, if we look at someone like Green River Project, there's definitely an inheritance from Blanc, and finding those connections. Yeah, if you look at Liz Collins here, I can think of Lenora Tani too. So we certainly were crossing time from our choices in the contemporary artists.
Yeah, and at the same time, it shows how much has changed since the original show. So Liz is a great example of that, because not only is she working with the legacy of fiber art, but also she's thinking about the legacy of postmodernism. And then she's working with industrial mills and digital technologies, but also getting her own hand into the object. So it's that kind of complex, expanded toolkit that artists are working with now. Let's go on to the next slide. And Evan, maybe you would like to talk a little bit about Serban.
Sure. I mean, Serban represents, I think, a perfect transition of the arts in a way. You know, trained as an architect, making design objects, but more as works of art, and using traditional techniques of, you know, fabrication and steel. So I think he's one of those people who's really pushing boundaries between the arts, and I think that's a key aspect to most of the contemporaries we tended to focus on, as Abby mentioned just a moment ago as well, with Woody. And I think all of these artists tended to fall into that kind of category, because that's, I think, what we really want to represent with the current trends of what's happening in the art world or in the design world simultaneously.
Let's go to the next slide. I just wanted to say also that there's something there about draftsmanship in Serban Ionescu's work that's very interesting. So you start to pick up on these qualities that are not from craft, but from other mediums like paintings, of the way that he uses line.
That's true. I think his training as an architect does show. It's interesting that you pick up on that. Not everyone does, because his drawings are very architectural, and then they translate into objects, which is kind of a unique approach to making things.
Yeah. Abby, you mentioned Green River Projects already. Do you want to say a little bit about them and their inclusion in the show?
Yes, I'd love to. So Green River Project emerged out a practice out of New York City. It's run by two guys, Aaron Agela and Ben Bloomstein, who you see in the photo here. And they come from the art world. So Aaron actually used to work for Nate Lohman, and Ben for Robert Gober. And that is more of their training to be artists. And then they've decided to kind of step away from that practice and create this Green River, where they are making functional furniture, but it doesn't have to be. And it's sort of a constant conceptual process that they engage with. So, you know, how to tackle a problem or how to reinvent a material in a new way. I recently commissioned them to do some new works for the Noise House too, and they made lamps from airplane parts, for example, or their first set of outdoor furniture, and you see all the joinery and everything to really give that visibility of the handwork that they put into it. So there's definitely this kind of rough hewn sense to their works. You know, this is not finely perfected furniture. So to me, I see that legacy in J.B. Blanc, if I was looking towards the original show. But they'll work with any material. They just started carving out of stone. So, and that's actually another expression of what we were thinking about in the show too, is that these artists today are not isolated into any one medium. They're working with everything, and I think Green River is a perfect example of that. If it's ebony wood, or it looks like some hay in this chair, or an airplane wing, it all comes together for them.
Awesome. Okay, well, Abby and Evan, it's been great to have you on the program. We're just going to look at a few more examples here of work from the project before we start opening up to questions. So here we have Tiff Massey from Detroit, who's incredible, trained as a metalsmith and jeweler, but making things at very large scale. So that object, which will be in the exhibition, is something like 3 feet high. So it's a gigantic sort of wall piece that alludes to contemporary sort of street jewelry practices. And Kat, if you could go to the next slide. That brings us to our last two guests, who are of particular consequence, I have to say, because we have with us Michele Okadonor, who was the youngest participant in the original Objects USA, and Joyce Lin, who is the youngest participant of the new crew for our project. So here we go with the Youth Quake. Hi both. Great to see you, Michele. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
So good to have you. What an honor to have you join the program. And Joyce,
Nice
hello to you as well.
Joyce, yes.
Joyce, hello.
Hello, thank you. Thanks for the inclusion in the exhibition in this talk as well. This is a real honor and a really eye-opening experience for me, for sure.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to the program that you run in 50 years with whoever's coming down down the line by then. But let's start with Michele. So Michele, here you are. This is 1969, I guess, this picture?
Yes.
Yeah. So, and you're at the opening of the Objects USA installation in Washington, D.C. So this is a shot that's actually taken at the sort of, the big bang of this whole thing.
I'm just revisiting it with the Marimekko dress, which is a timepiece. Marimekko came to the United States from Finland to Boston, this place called Design Research, I think.
That's right, in Boston.
Which was the first place that brought Scandinavian design as a lifestyle. We didn't have lifestyle. We had things like a bowl, but this was, it elevated thinking beyond the realm of how we lived and how, in America in that time. So somebody in Michigan enlightened me to Design Research, and I was in Boston and went and bought a Marimekko dress and ended up wearing it at the opening. I had forgotten about this dress after and the whole opening till recently, and I'm so excited. There's a Marimekko next to Italy that it's in New York.
The tradition continues. It's actually a good place to start because the Scandinavian influence in the Objects USA project, of course, was extremely important, including a lot of actual Scandinavian participants, as well as those who had been trained by them. I think of Maya Grotel, for example, in ceramics as being important in that context, who was also from Finland. But if we could go to the next slide, Kat, let's talk about you and your work. So can you first say a little bit about these objects that were actually included in the original exhibition, and then what it was like to be curated into it by Paul and Lee?
Well, I came to Ann Arbor in 1963, and my teachers were from Cranbrook. They had studied with Maya Grotel, and the John Stevenson, who had studied with Maya Grotel, had just come back from a Fulbright in Japan. So he brought Sotsi Hamada to campus. So the convergence of extraordinary people and minds in the field of clay, of ceramics, was remarkable. The other departments had people, painters from New York who had retreated. You know, they were, but the ceramics had really, I would say, primary people. It was very, very vital. I was so smitten by the energy and the thinking. So I had not intended to go into ceramics, even though I did study at this small, beautiful, it's still there in Miami Beach by the convention center. There's a little old Mediterranean building, which used to be Carl Fisher's clubhouse, which then became where, again, a European refugee, her first name was Lottie, that's what we called her. I took ceramics as a child, which meant we rolled out clay the way you saw in your first beautiful photograph, and then we pressed leaves in, and we pressed wet clay through sieves and made pistons, the end of for the flower. That was wonderful for a 7-year-old, pretty great. So I was assigned 3 jars by John Stevenson, and I did not love the wheel or the making jars. And don't ask me how one of the things I turned in was one of these figures. And he didn't throw me out of class because at the same time, the California movement had penetrated by Fred Bauer joining the staff.
Oh, right.
And is Fred in Objects USA or just Patty?
Yeah,
Or
Fred
either of
Patty.
them?
I think
Fred and
Fred
Patty.
Bauer and Patty Warashina, then Bauer.
He came bringing the whole California funk movement overnight.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, this looked good instead of what? It was, yeah. So that I had a license all of a sudden to continue. And they gave us our own studios. They appropriated an old, smelly, moldy house next to the School of Art. But we didn't mind, and I was able to begin working like this as a teenager. It was in my late teens.
Yeah.
So then Lee Nordness showed up in that house, and I remember the odor. I can't picture Ann Arbor and making these without the smell of the clay gets moldy. I don't know if much you know about clay, but
organic,
it does hang together better, and it's better when it does smell. So that was, it's all associated, all of the senses, the touch, the smell, the sound of it, the getting the air bubbles out. It was a very visceral experience, and I came from a home where there wasn't even a hammer or a screwdriver. So if something was broken, my father called him the handyman. So you can imagine my hunger, my thirst for banging and creating.
So what was it like, Michele, when this extremely elegant New York dealer showed up in your humble abode there?
Well, he asked me, love the pieces. I had a few, and he asked me the price. And when I told him the price and he said he would take all of them, I went back and told my husband, I think I just made a big mistake.
Yeah.
So even at a young age, I just, well, that was, they must have been really cheap, but who knew what to charge? And you had to think on my feet. And of course, I never regretted it. He also offered me a show in his Madison Avenue gallery, which I declined because we had several artists in Ann Arbor, and there were several artists that had made it big in New York in color field. And I would notice that they would have a big run and then everybody had one and they were dropped.
Mm.
And I saw this and I said that you can't allow the market to dominate what you're going to be.
Yeah.
And he had asked me for about a dozen more of these. And I knew it would be very exciting to show in New York, and it would probably be the end of me also at some point.
Well, you were a sharp teenager.
Many people said, "Are you kidding? Why didn't, you know," they were, everybody was like, "What?" But I had other ideas. These were not where I was going. It was a process of exploring. And I knew then that it was about, I was just beginning a journey.
Yeah.
I didn't want to be known for, oh yes, she's the one who makes those.
So before I leave you and we move on to Joyce, let me just ask you one last question, Michele. So Gloria mentioned that you went not just to the Washington, D.C. installation, as we saw, but you went, I guess, to multiple versions of the exhibition?
Just Washington. I was curious to see, and I went down, and I didn't love it. It was very bright, overwhelming, and in a way it was disorienting to see so many things. I did not have scope. I was young. I knew certain realms, but I knew nothing about the jewelry or the weaving, even though Cranbrook had some of it. But the ceramics I was interested in, and I thought they did a great job. I knew who the Knotzlers were. I knew people, my teachers knew all these people and referenced them, and it was very live in that way.
And what did being in Objects USA, last question for you, what did Objects USA do for you after the fact? Was it important in your career, or was it more like an early sort of exposure to a world, and then you sort of went back to what you were doing and built from there?
It was neither. You know, it was, I knew that I had to begin to have, I'm going to use this in quotes, a premise, something larger, that I've always been driven by ideas, not by materials, which is why my work has such far-flung materiality. And the ideas were still in formation. Essentially, I knew I was very young. And that is, a teacher walked by me and said, "Miss Oka, I see you're a Jungian." Well, I didn't know what a Jungian was at that point. So I wanted to begin what I call self-mastery, so that I could bring to my materials work that would have a contribution. I was aware of the responsibility of taking up space in that world. So,
have you ever succeeded in all of those ways? And it's just fantastic to have had this time with you and see this very early moment in your stellar career. And thank you so much for being here.
That's very generous of you, Glenn. Thank you for your kind words.
So let's go ahead and turn now to our last guest, who is Joyce Lin. Joyce, I'm tempted to ask you whether you know that you're young or not. But
I'm always aware of how young I am and how young I feel. But I think in the long term, that'll serve me pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's certainly a youthful vibrancy, but also a tremendous sophistication to your work, which of course is why we wanted to have you in the show and also here on the program. So thanks so much for joining us. I wonder if you could say a little bit about your own artistic journey thus far, and a little bit about your work and how you're approaching it methodologically.
Sure. I recently graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design and Brown University. I did a 5-year dual degree program where I did furniture design at RISD and geology biology at Brown University. So I graduated in 2017. And since then, I relocated to Houston, which is where my parents live. And I've been working at Makerspace downtown, working as a woodshop manager and a woodshop tech and an instructor. So having access to, make my own work. And I also did an artist residency at the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft.
Great.
Since graduating, I've just sort of kept going. I don't think I've ever really stopped. I've been doing, art all of my life. I went to a fine arts high school, so I was doing sculpture there, specifically kinetic sculpture. From there to RISD, going to furniture design and actual design work, it was kind of a natural and also unnatural transition to go from sculpture to objects with a more practical function. So function has always been sort of a really interesting concept to me, not just like how an object works, but also starting to think about how the role it plays in our everyday lives, and the power for design objects to sort of break that barrier between the viewer and like the thing on the wall, and to sort of exist with a thing. So this piece here is called Egg Chair. I made this during my residency in 2019 at the Craft Center. So this is a CNC plywood armature, spray foam, and then body filler with fiber reinforcement and more body filler, Bondo basically, and then primed with a smooth and enamel paint. So it's glossy on the outside, and then the back and the seat are plexiglass. So a lot of the work that I've been doing has been folks centered around this idea of connection and disconnection. So I think through my process of like learning about more and more materials, it's kind of been this strange thing where the more materials that I learn, the more power I have.
Yeah. And one of the things that's very interesting about the practice, both the egg chair and the one that we're looking at now, is that you have this, what seems to me to be a very kind of digital vision, in the sense that you're using technology in very inventive ways, and also kind of bringing a sort of X-ray vision or structural transparency to the objects, but you're doing it entirely in analog techniques usually, as I understand it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this work was one I also did at the very start of my residency, actually, which was it's called Skinned Chair, and it was sort of this process of actually taking a found furniture from just a cheap chair from the thrift store and peeling off the outer layers with a scroll saw. So what I was thinking was, I was thinking a lot about structure and internal structure and external structure, what we see and how something is made, and the sort of that duality of opaqueness and transparency. So what I was thinking with this piece was a structure that was completely structureless. I took the chair and I sort of cut it apart first, and then it's a really meticulous, slow process of peeling apart the outside, but I essentially do it as you would like peel an apple. You take a round object and just sort of go layer by layer by layer. In the end, you have all of these really thin fragments. So I took those fragments and I basically pieced them back together like a puzzle on top of a steel armature, but mostly epoxy clay. So that's what the blackness is in there. And if you look up close, you can kind of see like the fragments are kind of disjointed. They're not particularly smooth. But it's sort of, you kind of see the cut patterns are sort of an artifact of the process, where if you go up close, then you see the layer by layer. Anything in black is essentially what was removed by the blade curve.
Yeah. It's fascinating too because it winds up looking a little bit like wood grain, that sense of the kind of topology that you're mapping onto the surface of the object itself.
Mhm.
And as I said, it also has a kind of quasi-digital quality to it because it seems like an avatar of itself. Yeah, they're great. There we have the detail. So it's got a it's kind of a meta object. It's like an object speaking about objecthood or the ontological status of things. And I guess that was another reason that we wanted to feature you, as I say, not only in the show, but also in the event today, because it really shows how the concept of the object is still relevant to artists of your generation, despite the fact that we're all surfing this virtual world together. And I guess the last question I wanted to ask you was really about that. Do you feel that your work has been shaped by the technological apparatus of our time? Do you feel like you're pushing back against it? Do you feel like you're implementing it? How would you describe your relationship to all of the other technologies in our life that are not craft?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because I think the biggest influence, the biggest impact that technology and the internet and the digital world has on me specifically is sort of this. I would say there's beginning to be this blurring between reality and non-reality, if that makes sense. Um, what I would say is that because a lot of the objects we perceive now are through the web, and a lot of times when I'm surfing the web, I can't tell whether something is real or not. So, and there's, I think, also this push for objects that my contemporaries, like my colleagues, are making, are things that don't look like they should be real. There's sort of this pushing, this like this, I don't know, vomiting of the imagination. So it's interesting that there's the digital push to make things that aren't real, but then is also the push to make things that don't look like they should be real.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. Like the two things almost exchanging places continually to the point that you can't track which is which. That's brilliant. I love the idea that the contemporary part of the show in general is a vomiting of the imagination, a collective imagination, or let's call it an upwelling of collective imagination, perhaps. Well, Joyce, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been great to have you on this book launch event. And I think with that, we're going to turn to questions. We have maybe 5 minutes to take a question or two. I did want to mention that the book is out from Monacelli Press and also was designed by an absolute genius, Phil Kovacevic, who did such an amazing job, not only designing the book, but also coming up with this hand logo that you can see there, which has become sort of our emblem. And we're probably going to start printing up t-shirts and hats and so on soon. But I did want to thank everyone at Monacelli and Phil for making the book possible. And we can take a couple of questions. We're going to start with Forrest Gander, who's put one in the Q&A, who asks, I'm very curious as a geology major myself who taught at Brown, whether Joyce majored in geology, thinking about a career or just out of passion for the material subject, earth and rocks, and always thought of using it in conjunction with art, although I don't see geology specifically connected to the art we're looking at. Do you have an interest in geology, Joyce?
I have an interest in earth science in general. Originally, I thought about going into engineering as like sort of the obvious choice, but there's something about how the sort of serendipitous aspect of how things grow, and like so I stumbled into geology, but I stayed in geology because it's interesting that geology, rather compared to other sciences, is taught almost in like a storytelling narrative way. So when you learn geology, you're actually learning the story of the earth from the very beginning to now. So you kind of see how things are all interconnected. So it's not just geology, but also biology, chemistry, physics, etc. So I do think that ties into certainly how I see objects in more of a fluid way.
Yeah, okay, that's fantastically interesting, and it sort of suggests that the transdisciplinarity that we talk about with reference to this project all the time, art, craft, and design, is usually what we mean by that. But obviously, the transdisciplinarity keeps going, far beyond the precincts of the creative disciplines and into the hard sciences, as you're saying. You see a lot of touch points about that in the exhibition. Any other questions out there, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. We do have a lot of people, Michele, saying that you still look as good as you did when Objects USA opened. Just want to register that for the record, that I have to agree with it. And Nancy also, Nancy Lorenz, one of the artists in the show, talks about the installation that you did at Herald Square that we saw whisk by there. And that, I guess, Michele, it might be interesting to ask you just a question about the public art that you've done. We've been talking about objects this whole time, but of course you're also very well known for your large-scale public commissions. You know, I'm thinking about the Miami airport, for example. And I wonder if you'd like to say a little bit about that, how you went to the beyond object scale.
Well, I think we all started in the cave. So the DNA of creating was from shamanism, collective hopes and dreams, back to the Jungian, and Joyce also reflected on the collective consciousness. And that's a real thing. We are part of a big hive. And our day and age, we've lived through what Lewis Mumford would say is the Paleolithic model. I'm a Neolithic. I like the Council of Elders. The Paleolithic was the single king, which is certainly what we've witnessed. So being raised by a Roosevelt liberal and loving the WPA period, and having the privilege of living in Michigan and access to the Diego Rivera murals at the Detroit Institute of Art, understanding that you speak to so many people, and that is our job. What's happened with architecture, art, medicine, many fields today is they have forgotten their mission, which is to serve. But always, I felt that was inherent in what I learned from the Cranbrook people. That was a utopian community. The same with the professors who came from Chicago, from IIT, from the Bauhaus. The integration of our lives and the responsibility we all carry to be part of a bigger community is huge. And often today I'm reading that millennials are more community minded and that we can begin to look to solve some of these problems. We can look forward, and I'm looking forward to that because Cranbrook, IIT, all of these moments were what I call golden threads. And I was able to have the good fortune of grabbing hold of one as far away as Japan it sifted in. And Joyce, then it's been handed off even more. We build on each other. So it's so lovely to hear you speak, Joyce. And it's really, it's great to know you're a layered person. You are not somebody just invested in materiality and a marketplace, that there's a huge human component here. And that is what we are all, that's why we're here today.
Amen. That's such a great way to finish. So I think we should. Thank you so much, Michele, following the golden thread from 1969 right up to the present. Mina, do you want to give us any last remarks about where people can buy the book?
Yes. So on behalf of Iron Company, big thanks to all the panelists and especially you, Glenn, for taking us through this journey. And, you know, I think everybody saw and heard a lot. And the crazy thing is that this is by about 1% of everything Objects USA 2020. So this was a bit of a preview tasting menu. We are planning on having much more programming down the line through the shows, through the run of the shows. So everybody keep an eye out for all of these, more artists, more talks, more history. Also quick shout out to Jenny Florence for Monacelli. I think is the only one on your list. Huge participation in the book, wouldn't happen without her. And go to Monacelli website for 20% off Objects USA book with the code on the chat. That's it for me.
Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks so much for being here and have a great weekend.
Bye,
Thank you so much.
everyone.
Bye.
Hi,
Thank you.
James.